Hi, I'm Elizabeth, this is the Bookish North. Welcome to the third installment of this year's Sagalong. So we're still reading Njåls saga. This week's section is chapters 81 through 120. And I think this may be my favourite section of the saga so far. I'll get back to why in just a little bit. So in this section I feel like we are a bit all over the place, and I mean that in the geographical sense. We start off by learning of the fate of Kolskegg, Gunnar's brother, who left Iceland as we ended the last section, and we learn that he eventually converts to Christianity and goes off and lives off his days in Constantinople. So a pretty long journey for him there. Then we follow the sons of Njål on their endeavours abroad, and I find it kind of interesting that, harking back to the things I was talking about last week about honour and expectations, I find it interesting that it is the three legitimate sons of Njål that goes abroad, whereas Hoskuld, the fourth and illegitimate son, stays behind on Iceland. So we have the three sons of Njål going abroad. They go through Scotland and the Orkneys before they end up in Norway. And they do all of the things you might expect of them. They join lots of fights and they come off out of it very well, with more honour, more wealth. They are always described as being in the thick of the fighting, and they are manly men and they are doing what they're supposed to do. But towards the end, when they are sort of on their way of going home, they end up in this situation where they are anchored next to Troin, which we also know from previous in the saga. He is now the son-in-law of Hallgjerd. He's the one who famously earlier in the saga was throwing his wife aside to be able to marry Hallgjerd's daughter. He's in Norway at the same time, and there's a man called Rapp who is trying to hide from the Earl Håkon, and he goes first to the brothers of Njål to ask them to hide him on their ship and take him out of Norway, and they refuse because they say that this is not going to end well for us. And so he goes on and he goes to Troin instead, and he also says that this is going to end badly for me, but he still takes him on and hides him. After a lot of complications, it ends up with Troin and Rapp leaving the country and getting away. And the Earl gets very mad about this, and he takes it out on the sons of Njål, putting them in chains and saying he wants to kill them. They eventually get out of it, much because of the sons of the Earl speaking up on their behalf. But they manages to get away. They go back to Iceland, but this has obviously created bad blood between them and Troin. So when they come to Iceland, they ask for compensation for the dishonour brought to them by his actions. He, again advised by Hallgjerd, who has been no friends of the family of Njål, he refuses to pay compensation, thus creating more bad blood, and eventually the sons of Njål kill him in this epic fight scene where Skarphedin, the oldest of the sons, slides by on an icy ground, manages to cleave Troin's head in two in passing, and just keeps sliding past, and everything is going so quickly that nobody can stop him. It's an amazing scene. And this is where everything starts to get more complicated, and it ends up with Troin's son, who's also called Hoskuld, becomes the foster son of Njål. He grows up with him and is around the sons of Njål all the time. They become great friends. And later, for kind of inexplicable reasons, the sons of Njål end up killing Hoskuld. This is the first time there's a really a killing in this saga that is just not called for in any way by honor claims and stuff. So this is sort of the killing of an innocent man by 3 people that should have counted as his brothers. And so this is something, this is really creating problems for the sons of Njål, and this is when we leave this section, everything is sort of building up to what will happen at the old thing after this. And I feel like in this part of the saga, things are escalating in a different way than they were before. I felt like in the first section, when we were reading about the conflict between Gunnar and Njål, it was escalating. I mean, the conflict weren't between them, between the families, between their wives, but it was escalating, but it was still one man killing, one man killing, one man killing, one man. It was just that the importance of the men kept getting higher. You know, more and more high-ranked people getting killed. Whereas this time, it just escalates in becoming more and more complicating and involving more and more people. And because so many people are getting involved, it is also harder because there will be a lot more conflicts of interests. Like, for instance, a man called Kjetil, who is the brother, I think, of Troin. But he's also the son-in-law of Njål, and he has a very hard time of knowing where to place his loyalty in this conflict. And there are more cases like this, and people are trying to stay away because now both sides are trying to recruit people for their cause. Some people are trying to stay away, not having to take sides, and then others are taking sides. And we see this sort of politicking in the background when we leave this section, with them trying to get people's support to win the case at the old thing. And thus, you know, this is no longer a conflict between 2 families. This is now a conflict that involves everyone, almost. So it has escalated in becoming almost like a nationwide conflict rather than just a feud between families. So this bodes not very well for the end of this saga. So I think what made this section my favorite part of Njål saga so far is the stuff that has to do with religion. And now I want to go out of the saga that we've actually been reading this week again and just talk in a more general term and talk a bit wider about this. Because for me, my interest in this period and all of this started as a teenager, and it started with historical fiction. And historical fiction often uses these kind of transition periods with lots of conflict to create drama and to be, you know, high energy places to write from, I guess. And that was certainly the case for the books I were reading at the time. They very much dealt with this time, particularly then in Norwegian history, about Christianity coming and eventually replacing the old gods. And my interest at this time very much laid with Norse mythology, and I was obsessed and wanted to know as much as I could. And I was reading the Eddas and I was reading non-fiction, and I was really delving into this. And I was so furious with these people that made Norway into a Christian country, because I thought if they had never come here, I would be able to know more about Odin and Thor and Freya and, you know, all of the gods. Yeah, that was me at 14. But yeah, I've always been very interested in this, and I mean, most of the stuff we have deals with this time period where there is a conflict between the old and the new, and it is certainly a transitional period. So I love whenever that comes into play in what I'm reading in the saga. I guess that's what I'm saying. I feel like with Njål saga, in the sections we have read this far, this has been fairly absent. I mean, Christianity hadn't gotten to Iceland at this point, but also the sort of old religion is invisible in the text as well. We don't hear about any blods, you know, the sacrificing of animals. We don't hear about any kind of religious ceremonies. And all of this is supposed to have been part of the old thing as well, but we don't hear about any of those things at all until we get to this section where all of a sudden we don't only hear about Christianity, but we also hear more about the old gods. And when the Sons of Njål are in Norway, we hear this story about a hov, which is the holy place of the old religion, being burned down, and the statues of the gods being disrespected, and plundering the gold and the valuables and then putting it on fire. That was our friend Rapp who did that, of course. Any kind of mischief coming his way. But we also hear different stories like this, and you hear about the old gods and Christ's sort of being contrasted against each other. We hear this story about building fires where one is consecrated by Christians and one by the heathens and one not at all, and can a berserker run through them? So you get several versions of this where you see things like this. There's also towards the very end of the section we've read, it's an interesting part where Skarphedin is insulting someone, and he's insulting him by saying how he is picking horse intestines out of his teeth, which seems like an odd thing to accuse someone of, but eating horse meat was connected to the old faith, and it was one of the things that became illegal when Christianity came, that you were not supposed to eat horse meat. So in doing that, he is accusing him of being a heathen, basically. All of these details have been absent from the saga up until this point, but they start coming into play here, which I find interesting. And it's one of the things that make me feel like this saga is not one story, but it's just a connection of many shorter ones. The other thing I find really interesting is contrasting this experience that you have in reading about how Christianity came to Iceland and all of the stories I've read about how the same happened in Norway, because the two are very different. Christianity came to Norway in a lot more bloody way than what was the case in Iceland. And in Njåls saga here, we meet a man called Tangbran, who's a priest coming from Norway as a missionary. And he's not your typical man of the cloth, as we will imagine him today, because he is very much like the Vikings he encounters. He is a big, muscled, fighting man, and he does not really frown upon killing people that are against him. And that seems maybe like a weird missionary compared to what we are used to today. But if you're reading the King sagas, you see multiple priests like this. They are fighter priests to a much larger extent. And in Norway, the new religion was... having the words in Norwegian and trying to figure them out in English are not as easy. But the Christianity was brought to Norway by the sword. We had these kings that had been abroad because of conflicts, power struggles within Norway. There were, always struggles about the throne and who had the right to the throne. And Olav Tryggvason, which is mentioned in here as the one who sent Tangbran to Iceland as a missionary, he's one of those kings that uses Christianity as part of his power struggle in Norway. And I don't think it's a coincidence, and this is of course not my original thought. This is something many people before me has been writing a lot about, but it is not a coincidence that in Norway the new religion comes at the same time as you have these kings that are trying to legitimize their own power and gaining power over a larger area than before. Because, you know, with the old faith, you had lots of gods, you had lots of local traditions, and it all managed to coexist, and you worshipped the elves and your ancestors and gods, and the gods had faults, and there were, you know, different gods for different things. And then, of course, with Christianity, you have this one all-powerful God, and you also have the idea of a king being consecrated by God and being given the right to rule by God. And so that is very much connected to the rule of one person, which was the case in Norway and not the case in Iceland. So I find it super interesting to see the way that Christianity is made official in Iceland on this one old thing, where it's basically just adopted as a new religion for logical reasons. You have, at this point, two camps. You have the heathens and you have the Christians, and they realize that, both of them saying that they want to go out of the law because they can't coexist with the current law. And then you have one person that is to decide it all, and they all agree that what he declares as law is going to be the law, because they all agree that it is important that they all have the same law, and so he declares Iceland a Christian country. And then they all have to abide by that, and that is how Iceland was made a Christian land. And that happened a lot earlier than it did in Norway, even though the missionaries came to Iceland from Norway and stuff. I think it is said that the old thing where this happened is assumed to be in the year 1000, or alternatively 999. And in Norway, it is generally said that Norway was Christianed by 1030 at the Battle of... all of a sudden I lost my words, but at the Battle of Stiklestad, where Olaf Haraldsson, a different Olaf, was killed, and he later became a saint, so Saint Olaf, or Olaf the Holy, as he is known. But yeah, it was a much bloodier process in Norway, and you had lots of people being given the choice: take the new religion or die. A lot of gruesome stories, which is what angered me so much when I was a teen reading about this. And you know, when reading about this, hearing about Tangbran, this priest coming as a missionary to Iceland, I was like, I've read about him before, haven't I? I think he is in the saga of Olav Tryggvason, and I was right. So I went back. I mean, I found my Snorre's King Sagas, which are the sagas dealing with the Norwegian kings, and the sagas where we actually know the author. I was skimming through it, trying to find Tangbran, and he's here. So I thought I would just read a little section about how he is described in Olav Tryggvason's saga as well. I did try to look up the English translation on Project Gutenberg, because I thought that would be a much easier way to quote, to have an actual English text. But the translation there was terrible, so I'm going to try to make my own instead on the spot. So apologize if it's not great. But yeah, Olav Tryggvason's saga, and this is chapter 73. It says, when King Olaf had been in Norway for 2 years, there was a Saxon priest with him called Tangbran. He was unruly and a murderer, but a good clerk and a handsome man. But because he was so unruly, the king did not want him at his side, so he gave him a mission to go to Iceland to make it a Christian land. So basically King Olaf sent him as a missionary to Iceland to get rid of him because he was so unruly and murderous. And so we hear about how he's traveling there, and yeah, a lot of it coincides with what we've just read in Njåls saga. And then the final line is that Thangbrand stayed on Iceland for 2 years and became the bane of 3 men before he left. And then there's another section a little bit later in chapter 84 of Olav Tryggvason's saga, saying that the same fall Thangbrand the priest came from Iceland to Kong Olav and told him that his journeys had not been fortunate. He said that Icelanders had mocked him and that some of them wanted to kill him. He said that there was not to be expected that this would become a Christian land. So I like seeing the differences of the two versions here, because in the Olav Tryggvason saga you simply have Thangbrand saying that they're not going to become Christians, they mocked me, and some of them wanted to kill me. And in Njåls saga that we have been reading, he is saying a lot more. He's again telling the king that the Icelanders mocked him, but he's also telling about how they were so apt with magic that they made the earth disappear under him and his horse. And this is what makes King Olaf mad. Anyways, in both of the versions, King Olaf gets mad, and because he gets mad, he wants to kill all Icelandic people that are in the town they are in. And in both sagas, there are someone who's speaking up and saying that let us that have now accepted Christianity go back to Iceland and talk to our families and make it happen. And that is actually what happens, that those are the families driving the change on the whole thing. Another interesting difference between the two sagas here is that in Njåls saga, when you are reading about this events with the king, there are 2 Icelandic men speaking up, which is Gissur the White, which we have met several times in Njåls saga now, and also Hjalte Sigurdsson. Whereas in Olav Tryggvason's saga, there is a 3rd man present, and that is Kjartan, that we met last year in Laxdøla saga. Kjartan and Bolli is also there with the king. So he is one of the people speaking up, and he's not mentioned here in Njåls saga. So that's the fun thing about reading sagas, when you start seeing how the same events are depicted differently in various sagas. So that was a bit of an aside. And again, just in reading parts of Olav Tryggvason's saga now, just reminded me again about just how much more bloody and gruesome this process was in Norway. There's told of some heathens that Olav Tryggvason met. He's met them several times, but they are side men, so they are magicians basically. And there's an illustration of them here from a part of the saga. And what's happening here is that Olav Tryggvason has captured them and he's tied them to poles on this tiny island-like thing out in the sea that gets flooded in high water. So they are basically put on these poles out in sea to be drowned. And that is pretty much how a lot of the kings in the process of making Norway into a Christian land, that is how it was made to happen. Anybody who opposed them met a fate like that, and eventually there was no one left to oppose it, I guess. So that's why I'm so fascinated by the logic that seems to be behind this decision in Iceland, that we are one land, we need to have one set of laws, and so we're going to choose it to be the Christian laws. You may or may not like it, and there's also this sort of clause, at least to begin with, that you are not allowed to visibly do things connected to the old faith, but it's okay to do them in hiding, just don't do it visibly. And then it also says that that changed after 3 years or so, but it feels like a much more pragmatic way into the new faith, sort of. So I think that is my 2 cents for today. There are so many little details in this part of the story that I would sort of like to pick out and pick apart, but I think I'm gonna leave it here, and I'll see you around for the next and final video next week. Until then, I hope you're enjoying reading the saga with us. Bye.